Yo, what is up guys? Snap here. Today we're going to be talking about all of the party builds that we're going to be playing for the 323 Affliction expansion. Also going to give you guys a little bit of an update to the minion carry that we debuted in the last video here. We have a grand total of 11 builds to go over here, some of them being just a little minor variation of one of the builds, but nonetheless, it is a lot to go over, so let's just jump right into it. A couple things that are brought to my attention regarding the Spectre carry here. One of them is that the Unearth or the Desecrate actually does damage. Unearth is probably going to be a little bit better here because it just shoots a projectile and not a lingering dot. So you probably want to use Unearth over the Desecrate setup here, just so it doesn't have that lingering damage. You can also, of course, at the expense of a gem socket, link this to Brutality so it doesn't do any damage. In that case, Desecrate would probably be better, but this build is already a little bit socket starved, so maybe just go with Unearth, or you can try and jam in Unsets and put in the Brutality. It's really up to you. If you haven't watched the previous video on this Spectre carry build, I highly recommend you watch the most recent video I posted. It's a much more in-depth look at this new carry, goes over all of the gearing choices, all the motivations for the build. So if you haven't, start there, and then you can go over the changes with me here now. One other thing is that we have swapped our mark on hit on our Culler to Ass mark over Proj weakness or Sniper's mark. The reason being is that power charges on the minions are so powerful, and you can actually do 3 power charges easy on all of the minions because it gives cursed enemies give a 5% chance to grant a power charge on hit. It's super powerful, and I think it's generally going to be more damage than Sniper's mark on your Culler. So he's going to be doing mark on hit, applying ass mark to everything, giving everybody free power charges. One last thing here that I tried to squeeze in while I was POBing this, I really tried to find a way to make Vol Domination somehow work in the build. Unfortunately, Vol Domination is just so fucking clunky to get the original minions up. You have to use Dominating Blow, which is like an auto attack. You literally have to like run up here and cast this dinky little auto attack thing in order to get the minions to spawn, which is just horrible, honestly. But one thing I never contemplated using was General's Cry in this setup. It allows you to have the quality of life to just spawn the General's Cry, which will spawn minions, which will then go and tag enemies, which will spawn the minions for you. So it is much more automated. And then once your initial minions are spawned, you can use the Vol Domination to keep the big one summoned and have basically more super juice minions. And you can make the gem sockets work to gem a 4-link here, which is just a Vol Domination with a General's Cry, Awakened Minion, and an Awakened Edwa here. The full 6-man setup with a minor support, you're going to be hitting like 200 million per minion, which is honestly quite a lot for just like a 3-link here pretty much. I don't actually know how much damage these do. They do like 3 different abilities, but I don't know if they're like constantly sundering or AoE slamming or default attacking. Like I don't even know what this AI does or how this is calculated. Minions are just an anomaly really, but if you're doing something like 5 orbs and you really need to eke out as much damage as possible, this is definitely something you should try and incorporate into your build. However, I think it was our consensus that if you're doing deli mirrors or like ghosting, the content is so easy. This is probably just like a little bit too much to jam onto the build, and you probably just don't need this. However, if you are doing 5 ways, this is probably going to be a lot of extra damage, especially on single target. So this is probably something you want to jam in if you're doing 5 orbs. One other thing is I have a life-based version of this carry in case you're able to get your hands on a Defiance of Destiny here. Defiance of Destiny is honestly the strongest item in the entire game, and I believe it is honestly stronger than Mage Blood. And I basically converted the basics of the same tree and turned it into a life-based character with Pet Blood, and then it can also just throw on a Defiance of Destiny here, and this character just becomes immortal with just 1 amulet slot. So your defenses are solved. You don't need anything. You just equip a Defiance of Destiny here, and then you just walk around like nothing in the world can touch you. You do have to change a few pieces of the gear around. Like obviously you want life on your boots and your rings and your body armor instead of just the ES pieces that you're going for. But honestly, even at 3k life, you have a Defiance of Destiny on with Pet Blood, you're going to be immortal. That's how broken this item is. There are 2 more potential carry builds that you can consider for large parties. One of them is of course going to be the tried and true Spark. Now I still would recommend running this on Trickster, mainly for the extra leech that you can get. The Overleech here combined with the new Scion Guardian node that gives you a bunch of extra recovery rate is extremely powerful. It's a very good defensive layer. Trickster also gets a comparable amount of damage to Assassin, and obviously in large parties you aren't going to be going Inquisitor because you don't really care about Inevitable Judgment because you get so much penetration from a Cursebot. So generally Shadow is going to be the best pick. You can go Assassin, you can go Trickster. This build works on Deadeye still. This build works on Elementalist. You can play it on a lot of stuff. Now you might be asking about the prod speed nerfs. Obviously, Spark got a huge prod speed nerf with the removal of Blood and Sand, as well as the removal of the prod speed on the base gem itself. You're losing something like 70 or 80 prod speed or something like that, which is honestly kind of a lot. However, the reality was that Spark was kind of gapping every single other spell in the DPS department, and honestly, even with all of those nerfs, it's probably still going to be competitive. But I think the dynamic is no longer going to be play Spark or you're trolling. It's going to be you can play Spark, it's probably still really good, but honestly, you're not trolling if you're playing any of these other spells that exist in the game. I do think, however, Spark is not dead, especially in large parties, mainly because your damage is going to still be sky high on a 6-man party. The main constraints of Spark in a 6-man is that prod speed and is that amount of pierces that you can get. One thing you can do, of course, is to no longer use Peacock in links, which is power charge on crit, and then once again use Assmark to gain your power charges, and then drop power charge on crit for faster proj in links. Generally, this is like a dead damage support, but you don't need the damage. You need the quality of life, which is proj speed and pierce. And so putting it in links is not that big of a trade-off because the damage is already so high in a 6-man. I would also argue that this is true for anything that's like above 4-man. If you have a Cursebot existing in the party, your damage is just going to be so high that you can drop stuff like damage in links for extra quality of life. Other than that, this Spark build that we use in 322 has not changed at all. Anyways, we're going to be moving on to the Aura bots. Now we have 2 iterations of the Aura bot here because we have one that uses zealotry, an extra 50% aura, and one that does not use zealotry. The reason why this is different is because if you're supporting a minion build, which I am in this case, obviously zealotry does nothing, and I am unable to replace it with something like anger, even though it is an attack build, because we're unable to do fire damage because it ignites, as I've spoken about in the last build with the Ray Spectres. So first, if we go over the no zealotry version of the Aura bot, you're going to have a ton of extra efficiency left over. And so you can afford to drop stuff like bubonics on the boots and replace them with something like a March of the Legion. The main adjustment here from the no zealotry is definitely going to be the boot replacement here. You're going to basically be using the boots to juice a hatred to the moon, because fizz to cold scaling with hatred is going to be the most amount of damage that you can pump out here. We have a hatred that's level 33, has a level 12 awakened generosity here, and it is by far the biggest DPS aura that you can provide to the fizz to cold specters. Some other adjustments we've made here is I think now that you're relying so hard on your hatred and you're juicing it to such an insane level, it's also probably worth putting on a hatred string just to give yourself that much more damage. Now, before I was putting a rare belt here, it's just a crystal belt that had some flash nodes on it because these mods were necessary to keep your core skating uptime high when you're using this in a less flask charge recovery map. Now, when you're using string, you're going to have a lot less uptime on those flasks. They are not 100% even with the Pathfinder nodes and a bunch of these flask nodes on the tree. And so one thing you want to do to try and keep your core skating uptime high is to perhaps use 2. I am going super overkill on the flask sustain here because dying in a 6-man party to something like core skating feels awful. And honestly, the Aura bot doesn't need any of these extra stats from flasks. And so just guaranteeing that uptime on core skating is generally a really good idea. You can have one core skating with the use on full, so it's constantly just using over and over again off cooldown. You can have another core skating that is reuse on end, so that it might bridge the gap when your use on full core skating is sometimes down. This is really only super relevant on those minus flash charge maps, but this can definitely prevent some deaths. And because you don't need the extra stats on flash, having the second core skating is definitely the way to go, especially if you have to drop one of your flask belts as a result of trying to get more damage on the hatred string. Those are kind of the main adjustments from a traditional Aura bot that fits everything in and a hatred focused no zealotry Aura bot. You of course can sacrifice a little bit more of your energy shield pool to try and get a rare scepter here with hatred effect if you want to pump the damage even more. I'm trying to strike a balance between my ES pool and also the damage, and so I'm just sticking with the ephemeral edge for now, but you can definitely upgrade the weapon here if you want to juice the hatred even more. Some other things have switched around here. With the removal of Phantasmal Smite, I kind of moved the gem sockets around here to try and fit the Vol Smite inside of the Vol Caress here to try and get +5. Therefore, you're running a level 25 Vol Smite, which is in the gloves here. It doesn't have generosity on it, but it still comes out to be a lot more damage than if you were to just use normal Smite at level 20. And it's definitely a really good socket to do it. And then you can just move the Vol Haste over here to the regular generosity setup for the body armor. You don't necessarily need the Vol Haste for yourself, so you can give it to the rest of your team here. But that's going to be like the main adjustments for the Aura bot here. And we can quickly look at the traditional traditional aura bot that we've been running for the last few leagues, which has all of the auras, including zealotry if you plan on playing a spell-based caster for your carry. Once again, we're doing the main pathing that comes all the way around here to the left side of the tree to grab this elegant hubris notable location. Once again, the main motivation for coming alongside the left side of the tree is that you can come to the Marauder socket for a cheap timeless jewel. You can also path all the way down to Champion of the Cause for a little bit more extra efficiency here, as well as some extra aura effect that you wouldn't have normally. I believe this is kind of the 4th league in a row that we haven't seen any substantial changes to the aura bot. This is going to be kind of the exact same aura bot build that you played in the past. There hasn't really been any substantial changes, new additions, or anything like that that really make Aurabots super crazy this league. So there's not much to talk about regarding the cookie cutter Aurabot build. We're going to move on to the Cursebot here. Now, there's a few adjustments that we made here from the past leagues that we're going to talk about. But the main things we've done here is we have dropped this last large cluster jewel that is over by Divine Shield in order to pick up 2 brand wheels, that being the Runesmith, the Runebinder, as well as the brand equity cluster here with the rotating brand mastery, as well as the attachment range mastery here. The reason for that is we actually are going to be dropping the gloves, which is previously Vixen's entrapment, and replacing them with the Hands of the High Templar. Now, the Vixens used to be our primary means of cursing. You used to be able to socket 4 curses inside of these gloves, and when you cast one of them, 4 of them are cast, and you can basically curse like the entire screen. But now we're going to be moving over to an Arcanist brand setup. Basically, in your Dialas here, which gives the gems a bunch of plus levels and or plus quality, you're going to be using an Arcanist brand setup here that casts 4 offensive curses. The reason Arcanist brand is good to cast curses is because it has that automation, as well as it doesn't have a curse penalty for putting it on something like Blasphemy. It also rotates around using the brand, using the mastery, and so it's getting pretty good coverage here. Additionally, you put your 2 defensive curses with it, which is Tempt Chains and Feeble here, still on Blasphemy in the gloves. And the gloves are Hands of the High Templar to give yourselves plus 4 levels, which juices them a little bit more as well. You're still giving all of your max curses using Anathema and just getting some power charges on the tree. Pretty straightforward. Additionally, we have reintroduced Eye of Malice into this build. After optimizing the Cursebot a lot and also getting a way of exposure via the Starlight Chalice Flask, you're penetrating into the negatives pretty easily once again, and so you can basically multiply their fire and cold resistance into the negatives, and so this is definitely a hefty DPS increase if you can jam it in. That's pretty much it for the Cursebot. You just kind of drop the large, take some brand wheels, and then curse with Arcanist brand. It's going to feel a little bit better than the previous just cursing with Vixens, although that playstyle does still work, but I think that this setup is just a little bit better. Anyways, moving on to the Mana Guardian here. Now, the Mana Guardian, once again, has basically had 0 changes for like the 10th league in a row. I really want to have some like crazy new iteration of this character, but it's just year after year after year, there's like 0 new things that come out that could ever help this build get any better. Even with the Guardian Ascendancy, like nothing really new came out of it, so it's just the same build here. Essentially, you path out at the start of the tree here through a Timeless Jewel that gets some mana. You get Glancing Blows here to help your Aegis, and then you do this long-ass pathing around here to get a bunch of mana, and the reason you do the long pathing is for 2 split personalities with Int and Mana on it. You take some link nodes here because you're going to be the one soul linking, and yeah, this build is just super, super straightforward. One thing to mention here that we introduced last league is going to be the Centra of Benevolence. You can basically link everybody with soul link, give everybody super juice, crazy flasks. It's super OP tech, and honestly something you can try and use also on a duo Aurabot. But yeah, there isn't many new innovations here with the Mana Guardian. It's just the same old, same old. There are, however, a few interesting things to talk about with the Culler build. Now, once again, since we are using a minion carry, we are going to be using Wind Ripper now. You can still go for an early ascetic setup by using a white quiver. You can get a synth quiver that just has whatever stats you might want on it. Attributes and resistances are generally going to be very good here, so your Venter's Gamble can be a little bit worse. And then you can use the traditional blue helmet with the double rarity roll as well as the rarity craft here if you want. Other than that, it's all of the MF items that are non-negotiable. Additionally, we saw here on the release that we get this Nature's Concoction, which gives you 30% flask effect on 2 adjacent flasks when you use a tincture, and this is definitely going to be worth using on the gold flask and the distillate. I just put it on a random flask here, a Corundrum, and then I put 30% increased effect on the gold flask and the distillate here. And so now with everything up and max rolls on everything, we're sitting at 122 quant and 1008 rarity without tattoos, which is honestly pretty respectable. So making the adjustment to minions here and then going the Wind Ripper is definitely going to be the play if you're in a large party. One thing to talk about is the gem links here. In order for max coverage, we decided to do a Mana Forged arrow setup, of course. So the main thing you're going to be doing is shooting split arrows with arrow nova. So you shoot a split arrow into the air, it falls, it shoots a nova that shoots out in a circle. It of course needs rarity and brutality and links so that you are LE reflect immune. And then that is going to be triggering a mana forged arrow setup with rain of arrows. And you put it on life tap so that you always have the mana to cast it. The Rain of Arrows kind of auto-target stuff as it's triggered with the Mana Forged Arrow, so it's definitely a really good setup here. But yeah, this is kind of the setup we landed on. You can mess around with a few different setups, like you can try Fork, you can try some like Lightning Arrow, but I think we tried out a bunch of different skills with a bunch of different Mana Forged Arrow setups, and this is the thing we landed on. And one other new addition here is that you are, of course, putting on Assassin's Mark instead of Sniper's Mark so that you can give the minions power charges. And the last thing to mention here is now you can turn on Herald of Ice on the Culler here. Herald of Ice actually helps a ton with freezing and proliferating in the clear. You of course need to link it to rarity. You can also link it to increased area of effect to get more chaining explosions. Other than that, since we don't have tattoos anymore, you still are going to be doing the pathing to a million voices tree here. Should be pretty similar to what you've seen with a bunch of Cullers we made in the past. This is a level 95 tree. You can path to one more jewel socket if you do get to level 100, but this is kind of the basics of what your Culler should look like. There's one last thing to mention here, and we did look into thoroughly using a micro distillery belt instead of a Bisco's here. The idea being you can use a micro distillery and put your tincture in the last slot, and because it's not a flask, you can still get the extra flask effect. And the TLDR is that can be better than Bisco's. However, if you are able to get either a quant or a rarity corruption on Bisco's, this Bisco's is honestly just straight up better, and for culling purposes, the micro distillery is not worth it. With no corruptions involved, a micro distillery will be better up until about 600 rampage stacks. And at that point, Bisco's will outcompete it for rarity purposes. It gives you the same amount of quantity. So you're probably just going to want to go Bisco's through and through, and then just look for a rarity or a quant corruption when you're able to get it. There's one other thing to talk about here, and that is you can use a Bisco's collar, especially if you're able to get a quant corruption on it, and then you can get more rarity on your helmet with something like this rare Vol mask. This is one option for you. The idea behind the Bisco's collar is that the majority of the valuable mobs that you're killing are going to be white and blue mobs that are coming out of strong boxes. And if you're ghosting them specifically, you get a lot of value and a lot more quant out of those regular normal mobs. We ran a couple tests with this last league, and the Bisco's collar is just a little bit better than Ascetic in terms of raw card drops. But I think early league, especially when you're fishing for uniques, it's a lot of money. It makes a little less sense. And now, especially with the ghosting nerf, it might not be super convincing unless you can really get a corruption on something like Bisco's. So we're going to just be sticking with Ascetic because it's super easy, don't need a corruption, and it is very reliable. Anyways, last but not least, let us look at the Ghostbuster here. Now, what did we learn from last league playing Ghostbuster for the first time? And the number one takeaway is that this amulet right here, Defiance of Destiny, is going to be your number one buy. This amulet will just solve the build for you and make you immortal. I mean, just look at this. Like, look at this, man. Look at this. Like, look at this. He's just standing inside of 100 mobs. His health bar is not moving. Why is this okay? Why did it go core? I don't know, man. But yeah, you just get a Defiance of Destiny. The rest of the build doesn't really matter. You can just kind of run around. We also have a lot less movement speed than before. I think we overbuilt for movement speed on the original Ghoster character. You do not need this much. Sitting around 3, 4, maybe 500% max is probably where you're going to want to be at. We're trying to keep the cost of this build down by using stuff like Aurum Borax to help res cap. You can use Duresso's Courage to get a bunch of block. Viridi's Veil with a blue ring to get the immune to crit as well as the damage on Lucky is a super good thing to put here. Queen of the Forest, just some rare stuff to help get suppression, life, chaos, and Ellie res. And yeah, all of this stuff is just super easy to put together. It is very cheap, besides maybe Defiance of Destiny, but we really do not know how rare this is. But if you're making a Ghostbuster, this should be your number one purchase regardless of cost. One other thing to mention here is we incorporated the stun mastery with the Duresso's Courage. This mastery here that gives you 20 life and mana on block is super OP. When you immediately get capped block from the Duresso's Courage, it is just super, super good. The main motivations for this build was to keep the cost way down, get it as cheap as possible, as well as immortal as possible. So you just use Defiance, and then everything else sucks sucks garbage, and your Ghostbuster is just going to be immortal. Last but not least is going to be the minor support if you are choosing to play one. Now, with the nerf to Ghostbusting, there is a question on whether or not you're going to be playing a Ghostbuster or not, and in some situations you might opt to go for Abyss, which I'll explain a little bit later. If you're no longer Ghostbusting, your 6th party member is almost certainly going to be a minor support. If you're unconvinced of the power of this particular build, we can look at the damage of our current Spectre carry is at 588 million, and we can add the minor support here. If we add it to the config here, it goes straight to 1.3 billion. That is the true power of the minor support. It is not to be taken lightly. Your damage issues just evaporate if you have one of these in the party. So we can kind of go over a new iteration that we built here with some changes that we've made. Since the inception of this build, we've kind of changed the pathing from top side to go down to foresight. The reason for that is you can get a very quick timeless jewel here with supreme ostentation, so you don't have any attribute requirements. This allows you to put on a very big utility item, which is Garb of the Ephemeral. This is super useful, especially if you're doing 5-orb delirium, so that people don't get stuck in the mud. Also, this reduces the cost of your Animate Guardian when it dies, so having this on a player is super nice. Normally this item is impossible to equip because it has a massive 600 strength and 750 int requirement, but Supreme Ostentation makes this possible. Additionally, with new aura effect breakpoints, you do not need a 3rd large cluster jewel here to hit the amount of mine breakpoints that you need. The reason for that is because Stormblast Mine has received a big quality change, which is 0 to 1% damage taken to enemies near it at 20 quality. You can link this to Enhance to get 2% increased damage taken, which means you need significantly less aura effect to hit the cap than you needed before. So in the Stormblast Mine setup here, you can use a level 1 Stormblast Mine here to keep the reservation cost low, as well as a level 3 Enhance with a Corruption or any other source of global +1 on the Enhance to hit 40 quality. When you hit 40 quality, it's going to be 5% increased damage taken, which makes your aura effect needs a lot lower. So by our calculations, you're going to need 13 portal mines to hit the cap on high impact, and you're going to need 7 or 8 Stormblast mines to hit the cap. And the way this works is because you throw 5 mines at a time with Minefield, if you do 3 throws of portal mines for 15, and then you throw 2 casts of Stormblast mine, you're going to be sitting at 13 portal mines and 9 Stormblast mines given our mine cap, which is 23, which will hit the caps for both. So once you've hit the caps for both of your mines, your next job is to just get as much ES as you can, some defenses for yourself, and then there's additional utility you can jam on. Additional utility being in the form of the belt, the Torrent's Reclamation here. This is just 10% action speed. The uptime on this is very good. It also gives a lot of damage to the Spectre minions. And then the other utility you can jam on is, of course, the aspect of the spider. You have extra reservation left over. It's very easy to jam this in, so you can just craft it onto one of your rings and you're good to go. You can jam even more utility in the form of a Perkle's Toe on this character, but it's not super necessary as the damage in the party is already sky high, so you can just go for any ES amulet and call it a day. Shout out here to Duresso's Courage. Also, once again, if you have a free shield slot and you want a lot of extra defenses, Duresso's Courage is super good. I would recommend this on a lot of support builds. It makes you feel incredibly tanky. But yeah, from there, you just path to a bunch of ES. You can also get a large chunk of suppression here from this 5-point Wonder Wheel over here. Puts you straight at 54 suppression for just this amount of investment. It's definitely worth taking over here. Additionally, 2 necessary masteries you have to take are these Mine Masteries here, which is 2% reduced damage for each mine near an enemy up to 10, and then also your mines cannot be damaged. You obviously don't want your mines to die when they're debuffing the enemy, so this is definitely very necessary. This build is also super cheap. The goal is to keep the cost low for all of these builds. Yeah, that's pretty much all there is to talk about regarding the minor support. So let us move on to the Penance character that I have been messing around with. Now, I'm not going to try and explain the math regarding all of the added damage that goes on here, but basically this added damage is from Smite, and this added damage here is from skill gaining a different formula for the conversion. You also need to keep the stages at 1 for this POB for it to calculate correctly, but this should theoretically be calculating correctly the amount of damage that you would be getting on the brand. Now, Penance brand got a very big rework in the 323 patch, and I think it is now probably going to be one of the highest damage duo builds you can play. However, it is probably going to have a pretty poor quality of life in regards to a move and clearing play style. If you're going to be standing still in one spot, I think it is going to be excellent for stuff like ultimatum, invitations, this kind of thing. But if you're going to be like shield charging and casting and then shield charging and then casting, I could see how Penance brand might be a little bit of an annoying play style. And in that situation, stuff like Stormbrand might work out better because you can honestly get enough damage on Stormbrand that it might not matter. But I think for the amount of cost that you put into these two builds, your damage is probably going to be higher than Spark and or Stormbrand. So for duo builds who are looking to push a lot of damage and might not necessarily care about the quality of life, I would highly recommend looking into Penance Brand. And if the Penance Brand stuff doesn't feel very good, you can always just fall back onto Stormbrand. And if that also doesn't feel very good for you, you can always fall back onto Spark. The beauty of using Nebulous Call of the Brotherhood, this conversion chain style build, is that you can basically use any fizz or any lightning spell and make some minor changes to the tree and your gearing, and the build will be a-okay. So you have a plethora of skills to choose from, and you won't need to feel bad about choosing the wrong skill because it's super easy to pivot to a different skill if it doesn't feel very good. So let's look at Penance and what they did to it and kind of how it works now. So basically it has a sky-high base damage and a sky-high damage effectiveness of 570%. However, it activates now every 0.1 seconds instead of every 0.5, which means it's charging up 5 times faster than before. However, it did lose this one big line, which is 150% more damage with hits per energy after the first. And basically this made you have a 2,850% more damage multiplier, which made this skill hit like a truck. But it's been moved a little bit. The power has been put into the 5 times faster activation frequency. The base damage got a lot higher, and the added effectiveness is also a lot higher as well. So on this duo build, I've mainly built for AoE through the means of Vast Power and Assert Dominance with just a bunch of power charges on Assassin. And I mainly built for attachment range here. So this is what your attachment range is going to look like, and your AoE is going to look something like this. But the damage definitely looks super respectable at first glance. It's probably going to be around 100 million with this gear on. I don't have anything too crazy on. It's just 2 Nebulous, 2 Call of the Brotherhood, Incandescent Heart. It's some pretty cookie cutter gear equipped here. Now, this can be played on Trickster, it can be played on Assassin, it can be played on Occultist if you're looking for Explode. It can also be played on Inquiz. The reason to go Inquiz here is it's probably going to feel a little bit better for your progression. Obviously, getting the Inquiz regen as well as the Ignore crit is probably going to be super helpful on progression. You do need to look into going like Pet Blood Low Life if you're going for this particular playstyle here. I'd say if you're looking to transition or respec into this build, a more shadow-based version is probably going to be better. I think the top end of Shadow is going to be a lot better. The main reason for that is going to be you don't really need to care about Pen with the existence of the Elemental Inversion Mastery as well as Abhorrent Interrogation because you have such a high cast speed and a pretty high hit rate as well. With a Balance of Terror, which are super available with the reintroduction of Sanctum League, you can inflict a lot of Wither and you can basically get a ton of extra damage taken and you don't need penetration. And so typically the higher budget or the higher end that your gear goes, typically shadow-based builds are going to be out DPSing Inquisitor-based builds, but Inquisitor-based builds are probably going to be better for progression. That being said, the other mentionable shout out here is going to be Occultist for Explode. Now, this is going to be just the easiest place to get Explode. The other place you can also get it is going to also be Impulsas with AoE scaling. That's one other place to get it. I think that might be the only saving grace to make Penance Brand feel good in a moving and clearing playstyle. If you're planning on doing something like Ultimatum, I don't think it matters so much because you can just kind of stand still. And because you have such a massive attachment range here, it's going to like basically be covering the entire Ultimatum. And so any brands that do exist is just going to heat-seeking missile attach to anything inside and blow it up for just, 16 mil average hit. So those are just a few considerations here. I think that's all of the builds and the variants that we might be playing in the 323 expansion, as well as maybe some potential duo builds that you can run. One person I want to shout out as well is Haloplasm. If you're looking for like a much more catered, like nuanced duo build, it's not really my area of expertise. I typically do like large party type stuff. I definitely want to shout out Haloplasm. He makes like super good guides for duo. He also does like way more in depth, like if you want an A, B, C type guide, definitely check out Haloplasm. I'll link him in the description as well. One other question I get a lot as well is how do you level all of these characters? And I do have a video on that down here, which is how to level your party to endgame. If you're unfamiliar with how you should approach to level all of these characters, I would definitely start here. This definitely explains a lot of the philosophy and like basically how you can level a bunch of these characters to endgame. But TLDR, the minion carry here is going to be leveling as a Detonate Dead Elementalist. This character starts out as a Cremation Armor Brander and then switches to Detonate Dead at the end of the campaign, and then does DD all the way until he respecs after the Atlas is completed. If we were to level a spell-based carry in a Trickster, he would be playing Xang Mines, and then once again he would respec into the build he's actually playing after the Atlas is completed. As for the Aurabot and the Cursebot, there is a section in this video where I exactly detail how you should level both of these characters, so definitely look for that if you're looking how to level a Cursebot or an Aurabot. The Mana Guardian is going to be doing just a cookie cutter Arma Cremation character. You can also do SRS if you wanted to. It's a Templar. There's a lot of options here, and you can choose any meta skill that you want and just use it to push into red maps. And then he is also going to respec Mana Guardian after the Atlas is completed. The Culler just plays Lightning Arrow, or you can play Rain of Arrows, which is a super popular build. I'm sure you can find a ton of resources on that, but he plays something a little like this. I have included this in the Culler POB. There's actually 2 different gear drop downs and a tree drop down just for kind of like the scuffed bow leveling that you can do here. But yeah, this guy just puts on a bunch of MF pieces early, and then we just blast low tier maps until he respecs to a full culling setup. The Ghostbuster is probably best leveled as Poison Pathfinder. I think Seismic is probably going to be the best thing to play here if you want to clear Uber Elder really quickly or do Ubers. This is just a POB that we stole from Ben from last league, and we put on 2 Cold Iron points and a Mings, and it is now softcore viable, so this is something I'm going to link down there as well. And then once again, if you're looking to level the Miner support, he's probably best leveled as a Xang Miner, and then switching to a Miner support when you actually do a 6-man group strat. There are a few more things to talk about regarding the patch and a 6-man party, and that is going to be, of course, the new ascendencies and what we are going to be choosing and why. Now, first things first, the League mechanic itself gives you item rarity for the blue wisps, quantity for the purple wisps, and currency items for the yellow wisps. And now, obviously, if you're in a 6-man party, the most important thing is going to be targeting this item quantity. You might not notice this in your ascendancy choice, but the quantity of wisps you get gets increased depending on which ascendancy you choose here. And so immediately for a 6-man, the biggest consideration is which ascendancy gives you the increase of the purple wisps here. And that is unfortunately, I believe, the worst ascendancy, which is the Warlock here. So that means your map host, which is probably what the wisps are affected off of, is going to be a Warlock. Now, immediately, you don't want stuff like the Aurabot or the Carry to have this ascendancy, because you really want to have those characters have the jewel socket thingy here so that they can try and jam as much power into their character as possible. So that means you want a less important party member, perhaps the Mana Guardian, perhaps the Cursebot, or perhaps the Miner support to be the map host, and then select a bunch of these small nodes so that you can increase the quantity of the purple wisps here so that you get more quant in your maps. So that's number 1. You want your map host to be the Warlock so he gets more purple wisps. The number 2 obvious choice here is, of course, going to be the Pathfinder, uses the Warden so we can get the 30% increased flask effect for the 2 adjacent flasks next to a tincture. This just directly increases your quant and rarity for the Culler, and so this is an immediate no-brainer. The only situation that this would be worse is if you can somehow get a bunch of flask effect on the jewels here. It's possible that the jewels here provide more flask effect than the tinctures here, but we're just going to have to wait and see what the tincture mods are. But basically, flask effect is king for the Culler. As for everybody else, they don't really care about the power that you get from this stuff, and honestly, you're just going to be taking the rucksack so that you can take more stuff out of the map. A big problem in 6-man parties, especially early, the first 4 or 5 days, is that there's way too much shit in the map to take out, and you have to cull your loot filter down so that everything fits in the inventories available. Having an extra 20 inventory size here is going to help a lot. Not to mention, you also get the extra ascendancy points here. It can probably help stuff out like the Cursebot or the Mana Guardian if you need to, or the Miner support get a little bit of extra ore effect as well. So this is definitely going to be the popular choice for the rest of the build. So TLDR, your Pathfinder takes the tinctures, your map host has to be a Warlock and just dumpsters his ascendancy points for extra quantity of wild wisps, and then basically everybody else is taking the Primalist here and just trying to get charms that benefit the build. I think that's going to be the main way you should be approaching the League mechanic. I think if you are MFing, you should really just sack your ascendancy. You don't need the power and just get these wisps here. The purple wisps here is probably going to be the biggest bang for your buck if you're MFing, and so going for the item quantity here is going to be the way to do it. We are also going to try the item rarity thing here. We're just going to try it out and, respect the ascendancy to see if the the item rarity feels good. Uniques early can be giga money. So the only other consideration here is that the item rarity one might also be good depending on how the numbers are tuned. All right, last topic of discussion is going to be, what do you play in a 2-man, 3-man, 4-man, 5-man, 6-man? It's a very common question, and I have a few pieces of advice that might influence your decision. However, I'm not going to tell you exactly how you should play your party. There's a lot of considerations with how much you can play, how you want to transition, what kind of ascendancies you like to play, and all of that comes into your decision to try and figure out what exactly you want to play. Now, the first one is obvious. If you're in a duo, you should probably be playing an Aurabot and then a carry. Your main motivation is bossing. You can play Penance brand. Also, Ultimatum is a very good choice for this because you don't need MF to get the rewards from Ultimatum, and everybody gets a reward. Penance brand is going to be the #1 skill for that, I believe. If you're looking for a more MF-oriented duo strat, I would definitely lean more towards Deadeye and Lightning Arrow. Those builds are super strong right now. It's super easy to get a ton of MF on those characters for very little power loss. If you're looking for some Lightning Arrow advice, I would definitely look at Havoc616. He has a ton of videos on Lightning Arrow. He is a Lightning Arrow enjoyer. And the way you should be approaching this is, if you're in a duo, is look at what he is building for full DPS and full power, and then begin to remove items and replace them with MF pieces until your build feels like dog shit. And that's basically the philosophy you should have, is strip away power until your build feels terrible and then stop. Don't go any further. Some easy pieces of MF to jam on in a duo is going to be stuff like Goldworm Boots. You generally don't get a lot of damage from that. Obviously Venters, because you can get a lot of res. And yeah, the gloves as well. You just strip power away until it feels bad. And then as you get more and more gear upgrades, you can try and strip more power away to fit in more MF. So yeah, duo, if you're doing Ultimatum or bossing, I think Penance brand or Storm brand or Spark are all valid choices. And then obviously with an Aurabot. And if you're MFing, I would go Deadeye. It's super cookie cutter. There's a ton of resources, a ton of guides for that. If you're going to be in a trio, I would recommend running an Aurabot, a carry, and a Culler. We saw this a lot last league. If you watch any of the hardcore streamers, they were doing this in a trio. They had an Aurabot, a Culler, and then a carry. The reason for that is when you're ghosting, the meta content is really easy because you're doing a Delirium Mirror. And Delirium Mirror, the damage threshold you need to clear it is a lot lower. So you don't need stuff like a Cursebot to pump up the damage. Your damage is just already really good because the content is easy. So you can run a Culler and increase the loot that you get directly. So I'd highly recommend, if you're in a trio, it's definitely not a bad shout to just run a Culler as your third. You do not need the extra power from a Mana Guardian or a Cursebot. If you're in a 4-man, I would add a Mana Guardian onto your current party comp because you already have the Culler socketed, and you just basically get a bunch of free defenses, and it makes the gameplay just brain off. Additionally, the Mana Guardian doesn't need very many gem sockets. He can wear a bunch of gems to level, including a bunch of enlightens, enhances, and stuff. You can make a lot of money that way as well. Fifth is going to be probably the Cursebot here. If you're adding a 5th person, the Cursebot, it just gives you a bunch of damage through penetration, of course, and you also introduce temp chains and feeble. Generally, damage is not going to be your main bottleneck on a lot of stuff. It's going to be the defenses, which is why I always recommend socketing the Mana Guardian before the Cursebot. But the Cursebot provides just so much damage and just so much quality of life through temp chains. It's definitely worth playing here. And then last but not least, if you're playing a full 6-man, the decision whether or not to run a Ghostbuster or a minor support completely depends on the type of content you'd like to run. Ghosting did get nerfed. It went from 50 to 20 on the post-possession number. We do not know how good or bad ghosting will feel compared to Abyss, although I do think that the two strats are a lot more comparable now. And so if you're running Abyss, you'd run a minor support because you're no longer running Delirium Mirror, and so you want the extra damage for 5 orbs. And if you're going ghosting route, you obviously have to use a Delirium Mirror, and so therefore you'd be running a Ghostbuster. And those are kind of how you'd make those decisions there. One thing about the minion carry here is I would not play this in anything lower than a 4-man. I think the damage here is going to be lacking a lot. And unless you have the damage from like pumping a Cursebot, it's going to be really, really rough to play this in something like a 5-orb map. If you're running Delirium Mirror, I don't think it matters. The content is really so easy. You can just get away with whatever. But I think if you were to walk into 5 orbs with this minion carry and you don't have a Cursebot, it's going to be really, really, really rough unless you have godlike gear with like a Squire or something like that. So that's just a few pieces of advice I would give to you guys to maybe help your decision on whether or not you want to play like certain builds and stuff in your various party sizes. But yeah, that should go over like all of the builds that we're playing. Hopefully that's helpful for you guys. I do have one more video I want to put out, and that's going to be specifically like the Atlas strategies and the Atlas considerations that you want to be making depending on your various group sizes. There is kind of a lot to talk about, especially with the new ghosting nerfs. I think there's going to be a lot more variance in the things that you can run, especially with the introduction in Ultimatum. So I think there's a lot of stuff to talk about there. Try and get out that video tomorrow for you guys. But yeah, hopefully you guys found that helpful. Once again, if you have any questions, you can always leave them in the comments. I'll always try to respond to you unless your question is just really stupid or really aggressive for whatever reason. But yeah, once again, I'm Snap, and thanks for watching.